Dawn comes thin and gray over the forbidden city. Dust hangs low, a sour veil over old bronze and glazed tile. A palace bell gives a stubborn, lonely note. In the long, cold halls, a small emperor clutches a scroll as silent footsteps drum past. Silk striking stone, stone striking air, air clinging to ancient secrets. Men with the dragon badge ride hard, faces set like stone. While behind a lattice screen, the true power whispers prayers and checks her decree seals. The great Qing is tearing itself in two, and the tear is not clean. Eunuchs hush guards. A concubine bundles a message under her embroidered cloak. Somewhere in a vast, cold hall, a claim to the mandate of heaven scratches itself onto parchment and dares the world to answer. They call it the end of an era, but to those who wake each morning inside it, it is only duty, hunger, fear, and the promise, bitter or bright, that a new hand will soon seize the scepter. Out of this smoke, a name takes root. The Empress Dowager Cixi. The sound of her slippers moves like a rumor through the Imperial gardens. The boy emperor lifts his head far away. The bell stops. In the silence, the final dynasty inhales. We leave the gray fields of war for the bright, brutal, red walls of Beijing. We must now open the heavy gates and step across the threshold of 300 years, into the silence of the forbidden city, to understand how the last emperor was made, and how his empire was unmade, not by cannons, but by the slow, quiet erosion of trust, habit, and fear. The forbidden city is not simply a structure, it is the absolute center of the world. 98 vast complexes, nearly 1,000 rooms, a city of yellow roofs and red walls, built on the single, crushing idea that the man who sat on the dragon throne was the Son of Heaven. He was not a mere king. He was the axis upon which the entire world was meant to turn. His words were law. His face was rarely seen, reserved only for those who served him immediately. He was a god contained in silk and jade. 300 years of relentless ceremony kept the walls standing. Habit, ritual. These ensured that even when the man on the throne was personally weak, the institution itself remained impossibly strong. 1 billion people believed in the mandate. It was the ancient, vital glue that held the entire vast Qing project together. But history does not wait for ceremony. By the middle of the 19th century, the world was knocking, not with the bowing kowtow of tributary states and gifts of tribute, but with iron ships and thick cannon smoke. The sound of the West was a violent, fatal disruption. It shattered the illusion of celestial supremacy forever. They were the wars they called the Opium Wars, a fight for profit and access that the once invincible empire could not win. In the year 1860, the unthinkable happened. Foreign armies, British and French, marched into Beijing itself. They did not stop at the heavy gates. They advanced until they reached the emperor's private retreat. They burned the summer palace. The Garden of Perfect Brightness, a sprawling masterpiece of gardens and architecture built over generations, was reduced to ash and black smoke. It was the dynasty's utter humiliation, witnessed by the very stars. The Emperor Xianfeng, the reigning son of heaven, fled the capital. He abandoned the dragon throne, escaping hundreds of miles north to the hunting resort at Jehao. He was a man drowning in opium and despair, a ruler utterly unable to face the ruin of his own world. And with him went the entire court, the retinue, the eunuchs, the concubines. Among them, a young woman who had already borne him his only son. Her name was Yehanara. History will remember her as the Empress Dowager Cixi. She was 26 years old. She had witnessed the flight of the empire. She had seen the sacred trust broken by foreign fire. In Jehao, under the weight of illness and shame, the Emperor Xianfeng died the following year, in 1861. A boy, 5 years old, was now the emperor. The throne in Beijing was empty, but the power vacuum was immediately and violently filled. Xianfeng left behind a council of 8 regents. 8 men of the old guard were entrusted with protecting the boy and the continuity of the dynasty. This was the perfect, peaceful blueprint for transition. But Yehanara, now the Empress Dowager Cixi, had learned a crucial, violent lesson. The old habits of the court were no match for the will of the ruthless. She was no longer a concubine. She would not bow to a committee of 8 men. She knew the palace better than they knew their own scrolls. She had the emperor's blood in her arms. The dynasty was still reeling from the shock of the war. The smoke had barely cleared from the wreckage of the summer palace, and yet the fight for its soul had already begun. In the chill air of the north, in the temporary refuge of Jehal, Cixi looked at the 8 regents. She saw not protectors, but rivals Ho stood between her and the dragon throne. She began to whisper. To the boy's legal mother, the Empress consort Xian, 2 women, 1 child, and 8 powerful men. The long, cold journey back to Beijing would become a reckoning. The Qing Dynasty was about to witness its first, most decisive palace coup. A coup run not by generals and banners, but by the quiet terror of a woman whose patience had finally ended. The road south was long. It was the solemn path of a dead emperor, but Cixi turned it into a weapon. The 8 regents, bound by ceremony and tradition, moved slowly. They oversaw the heavy, winding funeral procession, the vast and cumbersome symbol of a dynasty in mourning. This slow, predictable pace was the first crack in their defense. Cixi and Xian, however, moved with ruthless speed. They took a faster, more direct route, pushing their smaller entourage relentlessly south toward Beijing. For the regents, the journey was a duty. For Cixi, it was a race she could not afford to lose. The further they rode from the old court in Jehal, the deeper the 2 women's conspiracy grew. Xian, the Empress consort, was quiet and less ambitious, but Cixi had shown her a fundamental truth of palace life, that 8 men of the old guard would always treat 2 women as political decorations. The men were building their own power base around the new boy emperor, and neither woman would be allowed to stop it. This shared terror became the chain that bound the 2 women together. But fear was not enough. To dismantle a structure of power built over generations, Cixi needed a man. She needed a powerful name with a score to settle. She needed Prince Gong. Prince Gong, the late Emperor Xianfeng's half-brother, was the dynasty's most capable statesman. He had been left behind in Beijing to manage the total surrender to the Western armies. He had saved the walls of the Forbidden City, while the regents fled north in panic. The regents had rewarded his loyalty with humiliation, sidelining him from the core council. Cixi now reached out to the prince in a series of urgent, coded messages. She spoke not of sentiment, but of necessity. The regents, she claimed, were corrupt and incompetent, already poisoning the child emperor's mind and ruining the empire. Prince Gong, burning with the fresh memory of his own dismissal, agreed to be her sword. The agreement was simple. Cixi and Xian would arrive in the Forbidden City first. They would use the child emperor's name and the Empress seals, which they now controlled, to issue edicts. Prince Gong, already in the capital, would be the iron fist that enforced those edicts. Weeks before the regents' stately procession arrived, the women and the young emperor entered the cold, vast halls of the Forbidden City. The gates recognized the dragon robes. The palace guards, long loyal to the imperial bloodline, bowed. The air in the Hall of Supreme Harmony was silent, heavy with the dust of centuries. In this absolute quiet, with no one to challenge them, the 2 women issued the orders. Edicts, signed in the name of the 5-year-old child, were rushed out through the capital. They were documents not of mourning, but of absolute legal revolution. The edicts stripped the 8 regents of every title and every ounce of authority they possessed. They were accused of arrogance, incompetence, and plotting treason against the dynasty. Cixi even changed the emperor's official name, symbolizing a completely new beginning, a clean break from the failed reign of the past. The women had won the battle for the law. Now, they waited for the men to walk into the trap. The great, slow funeral procession finally came within sight of Beijing's massive walls. The chief regent, Sushan, and his closest allies were traveling just ahead of the main column. They expected honor, a salute, and a quick return to their seats of power. Instead, they were met by Prince Gong's soldiers. There was no confrontation, no battle, no shouting in the streets. There was only the sudden, absolute silence of an executed plan. Sushan was arrested swiftly, calmly, and without a single shot fired. He was told he was a traitor to the Dragon Throne. The power of the 8 regents, which they believed to be unbreakable, vanished in a single, freezing moment. The others were brought to the capital in chains. The Empress Dowager Cixi and the Empress Consort Xian held a secret tribunal. The judgment was instantaneous. 3 of the leading regents were sentenced to death. 1 was allowed to commit suicide. Sushan, the most powerful of them all, was not granted that dignity. He was taken to the public execution ground and beheaded. His death was a quiet, brutal piece of state theater. When the dust settled, only a few weeks after the boy became emperor, the Qing Dynasty had new masters. The long journey back to Beijing had ended the power of the old guard. A new era, one of quiet, terrifying, and absolute control, had begun. The 2 women, now the co-empress dowagers, emerged from the shadow of their dead husband to stand side by side above the Dragon Throne. No one in the history of the Qing Dynasty had dared to seize power with such cold efficiency. The old court was dead. Cixi, the former concubine, now ruled a quarter of the world's population, and her long, extraordinary reign was only just beginning. For the official record, the court now operated under the dual authority of the Empress's dowager, Xian and Cixi. The arrangement was simple on paper but complex in the reality of power. Xian, the former Empress consort, held the senior, more respected title. She was the one who represented tradition, silence, and the accepted order of the palace. The true center of gravity, however, was shifting. History is rarely dictated by titles. It is dictated by will. Xian was gentle, almost a spectator in the great game. She preferred to maintain the rituals, allowing the vast, intricate clockwork of the bureaucracy to tick on as it always had. Cixi was the strategist. She was the restless, brilliant mind that understood that the old clockwork was broken. The China that Cixi inherited was a nation tearing itself apart. The palace coup was an event of great consequence to the few thousand people inside the Forbidden City, but outside the walls, the empire faced collapse. The Taiping Rebellion had consumed the South for over a decade, a bloody civil war that had cost tens of millions of lives. Foreign armies, the British and the French, had only just finished sacking Beijing a year earlier, burning the colossal summer palace to the ground in a final, humiliating gesture. The treaties they imposed were a wound that would never fully heal. The Qing Dynasty was failing its mandate of heaven. The only thing worse than a coup against a failing government is seizing control of a government that is clearly about to fall. Cixi understood this deeply. Her task was not merely to rule. Her task was to survive, and to force the empire to survive with her. She was not the sheltered concubine anymore. She was the one who had defeated the 8 regents, and that required a brutal pragmatism. Power, once taken, must be justified by competence. She began to govern with a speed and an intelligence few expected. She did not seek to rule by favoring her own family or faction. Instead, she chose the most brilliant men the empire had produced, Han Chinese generals and administrators like Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang. These men, once feared as potential rivals, became the bedrock of her new administration. She learned the dossiers, memorized the financial reports, and dictated every policy, from repairing the Grand Canal to launching a modern shipyard. The boy emperor sat above, a silent, colorful figurehead, but the reality of his mother's presence was absolute. Every document, every decree, every whisper of policy passed through the screen where Cixi sat, veiled from the sight of her male ministers. This physical barrier, the famed screen behind the Dragon Throne, was a new and profound symbol of political reality. The woman who ruled could not be seen, yet she was everywhere. This period, known as the Tongzhai Restoration, saw a furious, desperate attempt to save the dynasty from itself. Cixi stabilized the empire. She broke the back of the taping. She oversaw a period of genuine renewal and economic progress. She was, in many ways, the greatest sovereign of her time, rescuing an empire that all observers had counted as dead. But the source of her immense strength, her absolute, unwavering belief in the traditions and the superiority of the Qing order, would become the fatal flaw of her reign. She could adopt modern guns, she could build modern factories, but she could not change the fundamental nature of the society she had sacrificed everything to save. To look forward was to risk breaking the traditions that had empowered her. To look backward was to ensure the dynasty's final demise. The world was racing ahead, powered by coal, steam, and steel. Cixi, standing alone on the dragon throne, prepared to rule her collapsing empire by commanding it to stop changing. The stage was set, not for a restoration, but for 100 years of conflict between the woman and the world. The paradox of her triumph was this: to secure the empire, she had to become its living center, and in doing so, she became the greatest roadblock to its evolution. The traditions that demanded a man sit upon the throne now demanded her fierce, unyielding defense. Every reform she allowed, the modern docks, the telegraph lines, was a necessary poison, a compromise she swallowed only to keep the ancient form intact. She had saved the house, but now she was chained to its every stone, a magnificent, immovable anchor in a rising tide. While she fought the ghosts of internal rebellion, the true enemy was gathering not in the countryside, but on the high seas. The treaty. Ports glistening with foreign money and extraterritorial law were not trade centers. They were knives pressed against the Qing's vulnerable throat. The Western powers, Britain, France, Germany, America, saw China not as a civilization to respect, but as a territory to be consumed. It was a vast, passive feast laid out for the hungry maw of the industrial age. They brought their Bibles, their gunboats, and an arrogant belief that their relentless progress was mandated by fate itself. They arrived with the certainty that the Qing order was decadent, primitive, and waiting only to be dismantled for the good of all mankind. But the most painful cut did not come from the distant West. It came from a neighbor, one they had long considered a minor, culturally dependent satellite: Japan. Japan, observing the fate of the Qing, chose a fundamentally different path. They did not resist the storm, they embraced it. They dismantled their old samurai ways, donned the armor of the West, and became a true, modern military empire in a single, dizzying generation. This was the unbearable mirror Cixi refused to look into. When the two Asian powers finally collided over the Korean peninsula in 1894, the result was a shattering, undeniable verdict on the limits of Cixi's restoration. The modernized, nimble Japanese navy erased the Qing fleet at the Battle of the Yalu River. The Qing Empire was not merely defeated, it was humiliated by its former pupil. The treaties signed in the aftermath did more than surrender land and money. They surrendered the very concept of imperial invincibility. It was the moment the ancient world realized it was truly alone. The young emperor, Guangxu, watching his kingdom bleed out across a map, saw his aunt's traditionalism not as strength, but as a death sentence. He saw the undeniable need for a radical, absolute break with the past. The most educated men in the court, the reformers who believed China must become the world to survive it, gained his ear. He was ready to take the flame and burn down the centuries-old Qing structure to save the nation it rested upon. But the Empress Dowager, who had already saved the dynasty once through blood and iron, stood immovable in the center of the Forbidden City. She saw a weak, impulsive child destroying the fragile, sacred legacy she had spent 30 years bleeding for. The reckoning would not come from the foreign gunboats anchored off the coast. It would come from within the very walls of the palace, where two sovereigns, one of them hidden, one of them desperate, clashed over the fate of 400 million people. The final stage was set for a civil war of ideas, where a single, old woman held the future of the nation in the grip of her memory. The silence that followed the defeat at the Yalu River was not peace. It was the heavy, terrible calm before a storm that had been brewing for centuries. Emperor Guangxu had finally found his weapon, a thin, fiery scholar named Kang Yaowei. This man did not ask for slow, careful change. He demanded the complete surgical dismantling of the outdated empire and its rebirth as a modern state. This was not a minor adjustment. It was a revolution signed by the hand of the Son of Heaven. Over the spring and summer of 1898, the young emperor issued a torrent of imperial edicts. These were not the gentle, ritualistic pronouncements of an ancestor. They were decrees of war against the past. He abolished the old, useless bureaucracies that had done nothing but collect dust and silver for 200 years. He fired hundreds of officials in a single stroke, clearing out the rot at the heart of the administration. He ordered the creation of modern universities, promised a new system of competitive examinations based on Western knowledge, and established a national postal service to connect a fractured China. He even hinted at replacing the ancient Confucian monarchy with a new constitutional system. This period, barely 100 days long, became known simply as the 100 Days Reform. Outside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the old court officials watched in terrified disbelief. Their power, their prestige, the rhythm of their safe, comfortable lives, all were dissolving in a frenzy of imperial ink. For the loyalists, these radical changes were not progress but profanity. Each new edict was a betrayal of the ancestors, a violent shaking of the very foundation they stood upon. They saw the emperor not as a savior, but as a dangerous radical, a child playing with fire in a gunpowder room. They did not appeal to the emperor. They turned their desperate eyes toward the summer palace, where the Empress Dowager Cixi resided, seemingly in tranquil retirement. But Cixi had not truly retired. She was merely waiting. She was watching the young emperor burn through the treasury of tradition she had painstakingly preserved for 3 decades. Each edict he signed was a knife twisting in the sacred, fragile body of Qing Dynasty. She saw a nation being saved not through measured, conservative adaptation, but through reckless self-immolation. She heard the quiet, terrified pleas of the humiliated and displaced officials, the ones who represented the loyal heart of the entire Manchu system. She had allowed the boy his playtime, his brief illusion of independent power. But now, the game had become too dangerous. The emperor knew his reform could not survive while his aunt remained free to simply walk back and dismantle it. He came to a decision that no Qing emperor had dared to make since the dynasty's founding. He decided to neutralize his own sovereign mother. The only path forward meant forcing his aunt into true, permanent retirement, a gilded cage far from the levers of power. He needed an executioner. He needed a general, a man whose loyalty was unbreakable, a man who had the steel to defy the Dowager Empress and face the judgment of history. He chose Yuan Shikai, a rising commander with a modernized army trained in Western methods. Guangxu secretly summoned the commander and handed him the mandate: surround the summer palace, seize the Empress Dowager, and end the resistance before it could begin. It was a declaration of war, a final, ultimate betrayal from a desperate nephew to the woman who had raised him and ruled beside him. On the night of September 21st, 1898, Yuan Shikai did not ride directly to the summer palace to follow the emperor's orders. He rode instead to the residence of the Empress Dowager's trusted advisor, the Grand Secretary Ronglu. He did not ask for a sword. He whispered a secret. The air was cold that night in the capital, a sudden premonition of the violence to come. For Yuan Shikai, the oath he swore to the young Son of Heaven was suddenly weightless. He stood between two colossal forces, two visions for the soul of the empire. On one side lay the fragile, uncertain future promised by the emperor's nervous, rushed reforms. On the other, the Dowager Empress, a woman whose rule was not a matter of law, but a fact of nature, as reliable and ruthless as the Yellow River. Yuan knew the history of the Qing. Those who opposed Cixi did not simply lose, they vanished. The whispered secret he offered Ronglu was not just a piece of information, it was the price of his own survival. It was a new declaration of loyalty, paid in the currency of his emperor's inevitable blood. Ronglu wasted no time. He rode hard and fast, the betrayal burning in his mind like a lantern in the endless imperial night. He found the Dowager Empress not in the rigid grandeur of the Forbidden City, but in the relative sanctuary of the Summer Palace, miles outside Beijing. When the news reached her that her own nephew had ordered her capture, her forced exile, her neutralization, there was no scream of rage. There was only a cold, terrifying stillness. The Dowager Empress was not a woman who paused to consider fate. She was the one who commanded it. The emperor had given her an ultimatum. She would give him the swift, final response of a sovereign scorned. The coup had begun, but it was not the emperor's coup. It was hers. The night of September 21st, 1898, became known forever as the Wuxu coup. The night the emperor's 1,000 days of hope came to an absolute, violent end. Cixi did not wait for dawn. She sent the trusted Manchu banner armies into the capital, men whose allegiance was to the old system and to her alone. They swept through the Forbidden City. Guards loyal to the young emperor were disarmed before they could draw a sword. Guangxu was found in his private chambers, already defeated, the knowledge of Yuan Shikai's treachery likely already chilling his bones. There was no confrontation. There was only a simple removal. His brief, independent reign was over. His edicts, the entire foundation of his reform, were nullified in a few cruel hours. He was taken to an isolated island deep within the palace grounds, a beautifully crafted prison, the symbol of Cixi's absolute power. He was not permitted to speak. He was no longer an emperor. He was only a prisoner, trapped in the gilded cage he had meant for his aunt. But the imprisonment of the emperor was only the first act. Cixi understood that ideas, once loose, could not simply be locked away. The people who whispered those ideas, however, could be silenced forever. She issued the order for the immediate arrest of the emperor's closest advisors, the men who had planned the reform and encouraged the nephew's disastrous defiance. Kang Yaowei, the spiritual leader of the movement, managed to escape the dragnet, fleeing to the British embassy in a frantic dash that saved his life. But 6 other men, scholars, officials, patriots, were not so lucky. They were rounded up and dragged before the Board of Punishments. Their crime was not corruption or military failure. Their crime was hope. It was the crime of believing a new China could exist without. The Dowager Empress. On September 28, 1898, they were taken to the execution grounds outside the gates of Beijing. The crowd that gathered was hushed, terrified, watching as the final light of imperial reform was extinguished by the axe. The Empress Dowager Cixi, without ever leaving her palace, had restored the old order. The dynasty was safe. The throne was secured. But a deep, fatal wound had been inflicted upon the Manchu heart. The execution of the 6 gentlemen of the Wuxu, the 6 martyrs, was meant to be an act of supreme strength. It felt, instead, like the desperate, flailing act of a dying empire, shedding its own blood just to stay alive. And the blood that ran on the cobblestones of the capital had a cost far beyond the lives of 6 men. It was a debt the Qing Dynasty would soon have to repay in fire. The Dowager Empress believed she had secured her reign. She had put down the treasonous whispers and restored the authority of the ancient Qing laws. Yet, the price of that security was a deep, spiritual rot that spread from the purple walls of the Forbidden City into the heartland of the empire. The executions had not brought stability. They had brought a heavy, suffocating silence. The people were not loyal, they were simply afraid. Cixi had destroyed the last vestige of faith the intellectual class had in the dynasty, and she had inadvertently cleared the path for a different, far more volatile force. For decades, the wounds inflicted by foreign guns and foreign treaties had festered. Foreign railroads cut through ancestral land. Foreign missionaries preached a new, singular God who demanded loyalty above the emperor and above the family. And the imperial court, the supposed guardian of China, seemed either unable or unwilling to fight back. When the emperor's attempt at internal reform was crushed by an old woman, the frustration of the masses boiled over. The focus of their wrath simply moved. If the palace could not save China, then the people would save it themselves. In the dusty plains of Shandong province, a new movement was gathering strength. They were peasants, landless farmers, and discharged soldiers. They practiced a traditional martial art, a form of spiritual kung fu. They called themselves the Yihequan, the fists of righteous harmony. In the West, they were simply called the Boxers. They were a mystical force. Their young men believed that through rigorous training, ancient incantations, and divine protection, their bodies would become immune to the bullets of the foreign devils. They claimed the spirit of the ancient warrior gods walked among them. Their slogan was not complex but devastatingly effective: support the Qing, exterminate the foreigner. The movement was a wildfire. It began by burning churches and tearing up rail lines, and it moved with terrible speed toward the capital. Inside the Forbidden City, the Empress Dowager was trapped in a strategic and moral crisis. The flames of the Boxer movement were climbing her own walls. Her senior Manchu officials and foreign ministers begged her to send the Imperial army to crush the mob. If she did not act, they warned, the foreign powers would unite and march on Beijing for a third time. But Cixi was consumed by two things: an undying hatred for the foreigners who had humiliated her nation, and a paralyzing fear of admitting she had lost control. The Boxers were violent, they were reckless, and they were loyal to the dynasty. They were a tool, a terrible, blunt instrument she could turn loose. The old woman, reeling from the political defeat of the 100 Days Reform, made the most disastrous gamble of her long career. She silenced the moderates. She listened to the firebrands who promised that this peasant army was a heaven-sent force that would finally drive every European, every American, and every missionary from the soil of the Middle Kingdom. The order was never written down, never formalized. It was simply given: stand aside. The Imperial army was told to look the other way. And so the gates of Beijing, the ancient, sacred city of the emperor, were opened. Tens of thousands of Boxers, young men carrying spears, crude swords, and wearing red sashes of spiritual protection, surged into the capital. They moved like a bloody tide, burning, looting, and murdering any Chinese who had converted to Christianity, and searching relentlessly for any European. The city was plunged into anarchy. All that stood between the wrath of the fists of righteous harmony and the total collapse of the Qing Dynasty was a small, 200-acre neighborhood on the south side of the city, the Legation Quarter. Behind its thin walls were diplomats, foreign ministers, entire families, and every last missionary who had managed to flee the countryside. They were surrounded by a raging mob who believed they were immortal, and a seemingly indifferent imperial army. The fire that Cixi had hoped would burn her enemies had arrived to consume her own house. On June 20th, 1900, with the Boxers cheering and the banners of the Qing flying overhead, the cannon opened fire on the Legation Quarter. The world held its breath. The Empress Dowager Cixi, the de facto ruler of a quarter of the world's population, had just declared war on the entire globe. The sound was not the crack of 1,000 rifles, but the dull, horrifying thud of field artillery. Inside the narrow lanes and makeshift barricades of the Legation Quarter, the world did not explode. It simply shrank to the size of a few city blocks. They were no longer diplomats, clerks, or missionaries. They were the besieged. 700 foreigners, a desperate mix of American, British, German, and French citizens, were now huddled alongside 3,000 Chinese Christian converts who had nowhere else to turn. The converts knew that if the walls fell, the Boxers would not grant them the quick mercy of a bullet. No one had prepared for this. They had prepared for an angry riot, a spontaneous mob, perhaps a chaotic withdrawal. They had not prepared for the full, organized might of the Qing Imperial army to take its place beside the murderous peasant militia. The defenders were students, businessmen, and a meager force of 450 Marine Guards, men armed with rifles, facing an enemy that possessed cannon. The legation quarter was a fragile knot of brick and stone, a beacon of global presence surrounded by a sea of vengeful silence. For the Empress Dowager, who sat miles away in the cool isolation of the purple forbidden city, the siege of the legation quarter was meant to be a swift and total purge. Her gamble was that if she struck fast enough, ruthlessly enough, the foreign powers would be left with a simple massacre to mourn, not a war to fight. But the guns would not stop. The constant, low rumble of the firing shook the ancient beams of the palace, a sound Cixi could no longer ignore. Her generals, the men who had advised prudence, now watched in horrified silence. They knew the Boxers were not a shield, but a spark. The flames Cixi had intended to use to cleanse China were now licking at the foundations of her own throne. The court fractured instantly. The officials were split between the loyalists who cheered the expulsion of the foreign devils and the pragmatists who saw only the ruin of the dynasty. Men of high office were dragged from their beds and executed by Cixi's order, simply for suggesting that perhaps declaring war on the world was a mistake. The Empress Dowager was isolated by her own fury, convinced that she could not back down, that the moment for peace had passed the instant the first cannon ball struck the British legation. She demanded a miracle. She demanded the heads of every diplomat in the city. For 2 weeks, China sealed itself shut. The telegraph wires, once the thin line of communication to the outside world, had been cut, leaving the legation quarter a ghost, a lost city within a lost empire. The silence was absolute. The world knew that the diplomats were besieged, but it did not know if they were alive. But the frantic, final telegrams, messages sent mere hours before the siege began, had reached the capitals of Europe, America, and Japan. The response was not measured. It was absolute. The great powers of the world had tolerated China's weakness, but they would not tolerate its insolence. The massacre of their envoys, the murder of their ministers by a sovereign state, was not merely a diplomatic incident. It was an insult to global order. This was a challenge that could only be answered with an army. Across the globe, the orders were issued. From the docks of Japan, the ports of Germany, the barracks of Britain, and the bases of the United States, regiments were mustered. Ships were loaded. A massive, vengeful force was assembling, soldiers from 8 separate nations, all united by a single, burning purpose: vengeance. They called themselves the 8-Nation Alliance. Their destination was Beijing. Inside the legation quarter, the supply of rice was dwindling. The ammunition stores were dangerously low. Hope was being measured not in days, but in hours. The defenders were exhausted, wounded, and staring at the inevitability of an overwhelming final assault. Outside the gates of China, the Allied column was finally moving, a slow, mechanized tide of foreign steel and fury. It was a 1,000-mile march through a hostile land, burdened by logistics, racing against time. The question that hung over the entire dynasty was simple and brutally stark. Would the 8-Nation Alliance arrive in time to save the legation quarter, or would Empress Dowager Cixi have her victory, and then face the unstoppable wrath of a world she had irrevocably enraged? The race had begun, a final sprint toward either salvation or total annihilation. The march was not a parade of triumph, it was a punishment, 8 flags under. Hostile, indifferent sky, moving through a landscape that seemed to rise up and fight them with dust and heat. This was the true China, vast, ancient, and utterly unwilling to be traversed by foreign steel. They were a living paradox, men who spoke 7 different languages, obeyed 8 different kings, but were unified by the singular grammar of the modern rifle. They marched past ruined temples and the burnt-out husks of Christian villages, fueling their vengeful purpose on the site of the Boxers' destruction. This was no longer just about saving diplomats. It was about asserting a supremacy, carving an ultimatum into the oldest civilization on Earth. Inside Beijing, the capital was a pressure cooker, an impossible engine of ancient fear and modern rage. In the legation quarter, the defenders saw the sun rise and they called it a victory. They saw the sun set and they called it a miracle. The siege had shed its illusion of being a short ordeal. It was now a grinding, psychological existence. The constant hunger became a personality, a constant companion at the rifle post. The relentless rhythm of the gongs, the endless beat of the Qing army's drums, were not music. They were a countdown etched into the defenders' nerves. Ammunition was allocated round by precious round. Men had forgotten the names of the streets they had left behind, but they could identify the caliber of every shell fired from the Boxer trenches. Desperation had polished their senses sharp, forcing them to live wholly in the single, lethal moment. And in the very heart of the Forbidden City, the most ancient palace in the world beat with a fatal arrhythmia. Empress Dowager Cixi, the dragon lady of the dynasty, was caught in the impossible vice of her own creation. She had unleashed the Boxer fury, believing she could harness its power as a weapon against the foreigners. Now, the uncontrollable energy was turning back upon her. Her moderate ministers begged her to sue for peace, to somehow unwind the catastrophic war she had begun. But the hardliners, the princes of the Iron Cap, whispered of total, final victory. They reminded her that the massacre was already a global certainty, and to fail to complete the task now would show weakness to both the world and her own people. To kill the envoys was an international crime. To fail to kill them, after weeks of siege, was an unforgivable loss of face to her collapsing dynasty. The pressure built on the Dowager Empress until the final decision could not be avoided. She looked out over the glazed roofs of the palace, and she saw not a victory, but a reckoning. The final order was issued, crisp and dark. The legation quarter must fall. Heavy Qing artillery, held back for weeks in an unspoken acknowledgement of the political cost, was to be brought forward. The decree was simple. By the next morning's light, the last foreign holdouts would be annihilated. The marching column of the 8-nation alliance had, at last, reached the outer defenses of the capital. The massive, ancient stone walls of Beijing stood before them, monumental and seemingly impossible to breach, ready to swallow the foreign army whole. The final battle for the city was about to begin. That night, deep in the besieged legation quarter, the silence was heavier than usual. It was a terrible, stifling quiet. The defenders braced themselves, knowing this was the lull before the inevitable storm. The gongs began to sound, a low, guttural vibration rising from the trenches surrounding them. It was the sound of the Chinese forces preparing their final, overwhelming charge. The defenders gripped their rifles, their breath caught in their chests. But then, a different noise cut through the drumming. A sound that did not belong to the siege. A massive, echoing thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city walls. A sound of heavy ordnance firing, not from the nearby trenches, but from a great distance. It was the sound of gates being battered down. In the darkness, the defenders strained their ears, their hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against their ribs. Was it the Allied guns, finally piercing the outer defenses of the capital? Or was it the sound of the Qing army's heavy artillery, finally being brought forward to annihilate the last few defenders? The men in the legation quarter held their breath, unable to tell salvation from the sound of their own end. The night became a single, agonizing question mark. The distant thunder repeated itself, not randomly, but with the measured cadence of purpose. Once, then again. It was too deliberate to be a Qing warning shot, too focused to be a stray bombardment. It was the sound of metal against stone, applied by an unimaginable, patient force, the sound of the world's great armies knocking on the impossible doors of the Forbidden City. The terrible quiet that had preceded it vanished, replaced by a deep, frantic hope that felt almost too painful to be. Our salvation was not supposed to arrive this way, distant and shrouded in noise, a vague promise rather than a physical presence. The men holding the perimeter of the legation quarter dared not cheer, dared not even speak, lest the sound be a trick, a hallucination brought on by 55 days of pure siege madness. Then the rhythm changed. The big guns paused, leaving an echoing silence. And in that new void, another sound arrived, closer, sharper, and utterly unmistakable. The sound of thousands of rifles opening fire in sequence, a rolling tide of small arms combat that was not focused on the legation walls, but was instead tearing apart the massive stone defenses miles away. This was a battle line, a coordinated movement of men in force. A single high-pitched note cut through the carnage, a trumpet call. It was a Western military bugle, sharp and clear, not the guttural gong of the Boxers, not the mournful horn of the Qing Imperial army. It was the sound of the outside world, finally clawing its way back to them. Tears sprang to the eyes of the defenders. A choked, disbelieving cry went up, a single, raw sound of utter relief that was immediately swallowed by the noise of the approaching war. In the dark heart of the city, the Allied forces had found their weakness. While the American, Japanese, and French contingents were preparing their assaults on the main city gates, the British had focused their attention on the eastern wall, where the Imperial Canal entered the city. This was the Water Gate, a cramped, low arch of stone that was supposed to be impervious, choked with debris, and guarded by only a token few. It was a point of desperation, a last resort of the city's ancient design. Under the cover of their own artillery, the British First Fusiliers arrived at the dark, suffocating archway. They found the heavy stone and iron gate still locked, still bolted, and choked with the accumulated filth of the canal. The water was waist-deep, a black, foul current flowing beneath the silent gaze of the Qing snipers perched on the walls above. The men moved forward with explosives, wading into the darkness. The fuse was lit. And then the second, more immediate thunder. The blast was not distant. It was instantaneous and overwhelming, a terrible, concentrated violence that tore through the ancient masonry. The great iron gate did not simply fall. It disintegrated. The force of the explosion ripped through the water gate, creating a vacuum that sucked the canal current inward and threw a plume of black smoke and dust high into the night air. The first soldiers through were soaked, covered in soot, and completely unrecognizable in the dark. They clambered out of the breach, firing wildly into the shadowy interior of the city. The siege was over. The city walls were broken. But the relief was no gentle dawn. It was a terrifying, chaotic deluge of armed men, shouting in unfamiliar languages, storming into the city like avenging spirits. The men in the legation quarter heard the renewed, close-in sounds of rifle fire. They heard the raw, desperate screams, not the war cries of the Boxer, but the shouts of confused Imperial soldiers meeting a new enemy in the dark. The fight had not ended outside the walls. It had been carried inside the city, and now it was spreading like a poison fire, rushing directly toward the quarter. The gates to the besieged compound were about to open, but the defenders did not yet know if the figures they would see emerging from the smoke were friends, or just a more brutal, heavily armed kind of foe. The city was breached, and the real battle, the one for the soul of the fallen capital, was just beginning. The new violence had a geometry the siege never possessed. It was a disciplined metallic sound, a measured rhythm of boots and rifle bolts, moving with a cold, terrifying purpose. It was not the wave of desperate fanatics throwing themselves against stone. This new, foreign army cut through the night, straight toward the heart of the city, straight toward the ultimate prize. The legation quarter was saved, but the city itself was being consumed. A few miles away, deep inside the silent, formal geometry of the Forbidden City, the ancient heart of the empire was holding its breath. For weeks, the court had lived on raw pretense. The Empress Dowager Cixi had tried to hold back the tide of history with pure political fury. She had backed the Boxers, unleashed the Imperial army, and dared the world to cross her. Now the world had answered. The news arrived not as a formal decree, but as a whispered, paralyzing fear that traveled faster than any courier could ride. The foreign devils were in. They had not waited for a surrender. They had not paused for negotiation. They had simply blown their way through the sacred outer boundaries. In the pavilion of great peace, the flickering lantern light caught the hard edges of Cixi's face. The great gamble, the final desperate throw of the dice against the modern age, had failed. The pretense of control was shattering around her like cheap glass. The Emperor Guangxu, her nephew and puppet, was already reduced to a ghost, silent and terrified, watching the dynasty burn from the inside. He was powerless, confined by his aunt's will, a tragic monarch whose reign was ending not with a battle, but a whimper inside a gilded cage. But the Empress Dowager was not simply defeated, she was cornered. Her generals, once boastful, now reported a disaster. The relief force was larger, better supplied, and utterly merciless. They were advancing swiftly, driven by a thirst for vengeance that the Boxers had earned with months of siege and murder. To stay in the capital was to face certain humiliation. It meant captivity, perhaps trial, perhaps even execution at the hands of the very foreigners she had sworn to destroy. A living symbol of power reduced to a prisoner. The Dragon Lady would not, allow that image to survive. The Empress Dowager made the choice that history would never forgive, but one that ultimately saved her life and briefly prolonged the dynasty. She would not face the enemy. She would not offer the surrender. She would leave the dragon throne empty. She would abandon the capital she had ruled for decades, abandoning the palace walls and the millions of people who lived in their shadows. The order went out in the dead of night, muffled and desperate, passed from trusted retainer to eunuch to guard commander. They would prepare for flight. They would travel secretly, under the cover of chaos, shedding the silks and jewels of 500 years of power for rough, simple cotton. This was not a state procession. This was not a tactical retreat. This was an escape. As the roar of battle moved closer to the inner city, a small, heavily armed escort gathered at the westernmost gate of the Forbidden City. An empress who had once demanded kowtows from every monarch on earth was now preparing to walk out of her own palace disguised as a peasant woman. She was leaving behind the only life she had ever known, carrying nothing but a few scraps of jade and the crushing, terrifying knowledge of failure. The Qing Dynasty was not falling with a catastrophic final siege. It was silently creeping out the back door, leaving its ancient home to be plundered by the armies of the world. And at the very last moment, before she stepped out into the night and the dust, Cixi reportedly ordered a quiet, secret act of cruelty, a final, cold-blooded effort to silence the loose ends of her shattered reign. The act was simple and terribly quiet. The loose end was Consort Zhen, the favored young concubine of the Emperor Guangxu, Cixi's nephew and her prisoner. Zhen had always urged the emperor to stand against Cixi's hard-line conservatism. She was beautiful, intelligent, and dangerous. To leave her behind was to give the enemy a potential new empress, a sympathetic face to rally the shattered court. Cixi could not risk it. The order was given to the chief eunuch, Li Lianying. Deep inside the palace, in a quiet courtyard far from the western gate, consort Zhen was dragged from her chambers. She wept and begged, not just for her life but for the emperor's safety, for the dynasty's honor. Cixi, standing rigid and masked by the shadows of the courtyard, offered only the cold verdict of self-preservation. Traitors could not be allowed to live. The soldiers dragged the young woman across the smooth stones to a deep, dark well near the eastern wall, a well known for its clean, cold water. There was no dignity in the act. There was only the brutal, physical effort of servants fulfilling a final, desperate command. The splash was muffled and brief, a tiny sound swallowed immediately by the thick, ancient walls of the forbidden city. A final silence descended upon the imperial home. With the taste of fear and well water clinging to the air, the Empress Dowager Cixi stepped over the threshold. She was a thief in the night, disguised not as a monarch, but as a common northern farmer's wife. The embroidered silks of the dragon robe were gone. The elaborate feathered headdress was replaced by a rough cotton scarf. The thousands of attendants were reduced to a handful of terrified bodyguards and 24 exhausted mules pulling simple, dusty carts. The young Emperor Guangxu, still Cixi's captive, was pushed into the first cart, his face an image of haunted defeat. This was the end of 500 years of ceremony. Once they passed the city wall and hit the open road, the fictional power of the Qing Dynasty vanished completely. The journey was immediate, visceral hell. It was August, and the heat was a physical enemy, cooking the imperial court alive inside their rough disguises. The dust from the road choked their lungs and coated the Empress's once perfect skin. She had no clean water. She had no porcelain bowls of perfectly steamed rice. Cixi, who had been fed new and exotic dishes every 15 minutes for half a century, was now forced to chew hard, stale millet cakes given to her by sympathetic villagers who did not recognize the dirt-caked woman they served. She was stripped of everything, not by a foreign enemy, but by the simple, brutal reality of the open road. Humiliation was her only companion. The cost of failure was paid in every dry mouthful and every blistering step. And while the Empress Dowager suffered the indignity of the refugee's path, the gates of Beijing shattered. The foreign armies poured in. The disciplined, cold vengeance of the 8 nations replaced the chaotic, superstitious violence of the Boxers. Soldiers from Great Britain, Japan, the United States, Russia, Germany, France, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, the great powers of the world, met in the center of the Forbidden City. They were not liberators, they were conquerors. The looting was immediate, widespread, and systematic. Libraries burned. The summer palace was vandalized once again. Every private residence, every great temple, and the imperial tombs themselves became hunting grounds for relics, art, and revenge. The Empress's decision to hide was confirmed. The world had come for her empire. But Cixi did not look back. She could not afford the paralyzing sight of the ruin she had wrought. She kept her face hidden beneath the scarf, focused only on the west, on the dry, ancient provincial capital of Xi'an. There she planned to stop. There, far from the coastal treaties and the foreign guns, she hoped to rebuild the illusion of her power. The Empress Dowager was a refugee. She was a fugitive. Yet, buried beneath the rough cotton and the dirt of the road, the core of her imperial ambition remained absolutely untouched. She had lost her home. She had not yet lost the belief that she was the Dragon Lady, the sole, legitimate ruler of the Celestial Empire. Her escape was not an act of surrender. It was the beginning of the longest, coldest, most desperate winter of the Qing Dynasty. A terrifying, starving journey that would either end her reign completely in the western dust, or resurrect her as the most cunning and ruthless survivor in all of Chinese history. The Great Migration began not with a roar, but with a choked, terrified whimper. The Empress Dowager, who had never known a day without the finest silks and the rarest tea, now wore rough peasant cotton soaked in sweat and the fine grit of the road. Her face, usually powdered and placid, was masked by a scarf against the flying dirt. The enormous court that followed her was an army of stumbling, terrified refugees. Her loyal eunuchs, their faces caked with dust and their hands blistered, stumbled alongside her simple carriage, dragging what little food they could find or steal. The Imperial guards, once the proud banners of the empire, were now a desperate, starving rabble, fighting over scraps of millet at roadside inns. A world of unimaginable comfort, power, and prestige had vanished in a single, devastating afternoon. This was the empire reduced to its bare, painful bones. The path to Xi'an was 1,000 miles of unforgiving, hostile landscape. It cut directly through the arid Les Plateaux, a high, yellow desert where the wind carried nothing but grit and the ghosts of forgotten dynasties. The August heat was brutal. The winter that followed would be worse. Disease followed famine, and famine followed the retreating Imperial Guard. Cixi, insulated her entire life, was suddenly learning the true, bitter taste of poverty, a lesson the Forbidden City had shielded her from her entire life. She was no longer carried aloft in a magnificent sedan chair. She walked. She haggled for a bowl of watery soup. She slept in abandoned temples or on the floors of dusty inns, a reality that would have been treasonous to speak of just weeks before. She shed the magnificent skin of the Empress to assume the tougher, leaner hide of the survivor. Every mile west bought her time, and every mile west gave her leverage. She was getting farther from the foreign guns, but tragically, closer to the political reality. Beijing was irrevocably lost. When the Empress and the exhausted court finally reached Xi'an, the ancient capital offered only a temporary and brittle solace. It was far from the cannon smoke, yes, but the deeper danger had simply changed its form. In the temporary, gilded halls of the provincial palace, the mandarins and generals gathered not to plan a military counterattack, but to draft the terms of an inevitable surrender. In Beijing, the Allied powers, who called themselves the Eight-Nation Alliance, had installed themselves in the Qing government offices, running the capital city like a private, vengeful colony. The terms of their peace were already being dictated. They demanded massive financial indemnities, a debt so impossibly large it would mortgage China's economic future. For half a century, they demanded the execution of all Boxer leaders and anti-foreign officials. They demanded the permanent destruction of Qing forts and the utter, humiliating disarmament of the imperial family. The foreign ministers waited for Cixi's response, knowing full well she was entirely powerless to refuse. She was trapped. Cixi had survived the betrayal of her advisors, the invasion of her capital, and the nightmare of the westward flight. Now, she faced the true, final reckoning of the Boxer Protocol. The treaty arriving in Xi'an was not a document of peace. It was a dagger pointed directly at the throat of the Qing Empire. To sign, it meant admitting that the foreign devils had won, permanently. It meant reducing the Son of Heaven to a mere figurehead, a tenant in his own home, ruling only under the watchful, sneering gaze of the West. It meant economic servitude until the great-grandchildren of the current emperor drew their last breath. To refuse, however, meant a renewed invasion, the likely collapse of the dynasty, and the final, bloody end of the 2,000-year-old imperial system entirely. The fate of 400 million people, the legacy of her ancestors, the survival of her very house, rested upon one decision in the freezing, remote halls of Xi'an. The Dragon Lady, ruler of the Celestial Empire, held a pen, poised tragically between a suicidal pride and an agonizing, absolute surrender. The coldest winter was coming, and Empress Dowager Cixi had to decide if she would rule over ashes or simply become one more ghost in the yellow dust. The pen did not drop, it etched. The silence that fell upon the freezing, improvised court in Xi'an was heavier than the great bronze bell of the capital itself. When the paper was finally lifted, The Empress Dowager Cixi was no longer the supreme ruler of the Celestial Empire. She was merely its custodian, and a deeply indebted one. She had signed the Great Betrayal, the Boxer Protocol. The ink dried, and the Qing Empire was not granted peace. It was reborn as the Qing debt. The cost of their failure, their ignorance, and their pride was calculated down to the last copper coin, an indemnity of 450 million silver taels. This crushing sum was strategically chosen so that every man, woman, and child in the entire population of 400 million owed exactly one tael to the invaders. It was the cost of their civilization, amortized over 4 decades. Worse than the money, however, was the humiliation wrought upon the symbolic heart of the realm. The foreign powers now demanded and received the right to maintain permanent, armed garrisons in Beijing. The legation quarter, once a collection of foreign residences, was transformed into an extraterritorial fortress, a constant, bitter reminder that China was no longer the master of its own house. A foreign army stood sentinel in the very shadow of the Forbidden City. In January of 1902, 18 months after her panicked, humiliating flight, the Dragon Lady began her slow, deliberate march home. The journey to Xi'an had been chaos. The return was a calculated, strategic performance. Cixi had finally learned the harsh, necessary grammar of the West. She understood the power of public opinion, the necessity of a modern face. She knew the foreign ministers and their ambassadors did not want a repentant relic. They wanted an enlightened partner they could tolerate. She would give them a performance. As the imperial train finally steamed back into Beijing, the Empress Dowager did not hide behind the traditional veil. Instead, she invited the wives of the foreign ministers to her private court, trading diplomatic insults for delicate, modern conversation. She posed for foreign photographers, allowing them to capture an image of a gentle, grandmotherly empress that had never existed before. The old warrior had chosen to become a chameleon. The reforms came swiftly and brutally, a desperate torrent to wash away the stain of the past and prove to the West that the Qing could still survive. The ancient 8-legged essay, the cornerstone of the imperial examination system for centuries, was violently abolished. New schools were funded, teaching science, commerce, and foreign law. She spoke of constitutional government, of a new parliament, of a future where China would join the League of Modern Nations. 1,000 years of tradition were thrown onto the bonfire in a single year, all because the canons of the West had spoken louder than the wisdom of the sages. But this sudden forced awakening was a poisoned gift. The reforms created a new class of people, students who understood the West but were furious at the weakness of the East. They saw Cixi's actions not as genuine progress, but as a terrified old woman making frantic concessions to keep her throne a little longer. They did not want a modernized Qing Dynasty. They wanted the Qing Dynasty to vanish entirely. These were the men and women who met in secret, in the newly opened foreign-style schools and the smoky backrooms of the growing coastal cities. They read the works of Sun Yat-sen, a revolutionary who preached not reform, but total, final, destructive revolution. The foreign powers had been defeated, contained, and paid off, but the true poison had been sown internally, born of Cixi's own fear and the shame of her survival. She had thrown open the doors to modernization, and through that very door, a younger, harder, and entirely unforgiving China was now marching. The Empress Dowager was safe, for now, in her gilded cage. But outside the walls of the Forbidden City, the whisper of the Republic was becoming a roar, waiting only for her final breath to consume the dragon throne entirely. She was an icon of survival, a woman who had bent the flow of history to her will, yet even stone must finally yield to the inevitable stream of time. The Empress Dowager had cheated death and foreign armies, yet she could not cheat her own mortality. In the isolation of the summer palace, Cixi became a relic, still issuing decrees but watching her vast empire unravel from a distance. She was in her early 70s, and the political center of gravity had shifted entirely. The true authority was now scattered, held by ambitious regional governors and the commanders of the newly trained new armies, men whose loyalty was to their barracks, not the dragon throne. Everyone knew what was coming. It was a silent, suffocating game of patience played out across the entire country. The central question of China's future was reduced to a morbid waiting game. Who would fall first? Inside the Forbidden City, the shadow of fate moved closer. The Emperor Guangxu, Cixi's nephew and prisoner, had been a ghost for a decade. He was the perpetual, living symbol of her cruelty, a constant reminder of the failure of reform and the bitterness of her rule. Now, the ghost was truly fading. Guangxu was gravely ill, confined to his solitary island. If Cixi were to die first, the emperor would be instantly freed. He would rule. He would exact his vengeance upon the men who had betrayed him, and most of all, he would attempt to undo the last half-century of her legacy. This was a future that could not be permitted. A final, silent, and entirely lethal clock was ticking down the lives of the two most powerful people in China. Autumn of 1908. The tension in Peking was a heavy shroud. Then the news broke. On November 14th, the 30th year of his imprisonment, the Emperor Guangxu died at the age of 37. The official cause was a natural illness, the result of a long, frail life. But the timing was a tragedy too, perfectly arranged to be coincidence. No one believed it. How convenient that the symbol of hope, the victim of the Empress Dowager, should die just hours before she herself was expected to pass. The suspicion was immediate and final. A single, calculated act of poisoned justice, administered by a faithful servant ensuring Cixi's bitter legacy would not be undone. With the emperor's body still cooling, the Empress Dowager Cixi performed her last duty. She summoned the terrified court and announced her final decree, the ultimate, cold-blooded insurance policy for her dynasty. She named the new successor, a bewildered 3-year-old boy named Puyi, the grandnephew of Guangxu, a child emperor. This was her final guarantee that the court would remain paralyzed by regency and weakness for years to come. She had created chaos to maintain control. With that final, cold pronouncement delivered, the woman who had ruled China for nearly half a century finally released her breath. On November 15, 1908, the Empress Dowager was gone. But her ghost lingered in the silence. The dynasty was now led by a bewildered toddler, watched over by fearful, feuding officials. The final blow she delivered to the monarchy was not her rule, but the succession she secured with her final, dying order. The roar that had been waiting outside the palace walls no longer needed to whisper. The true final reckoning had arrived. The Qing Dynasty was functionally over. The child emperor sat on a throne of glass, and the revolution was only 3 years away. The Empress Dowager Cixi had chosen her final weapon well, a little boy. Puyi was not enthroned. He was placed. A bewildered, heavy doll sat upon the massive, hard wooden chair of the dragon throne. He sat at the very heart of the Forbidden City, which, now free of Cixi's cruel, calculated presence, felt less like an imperial residence and more like a silent mausoleum. The silence was deafening. The ghosts of the poisoned emperor and the iron-willed woman lingered in the halls, a twin spirit of vengeance and decay. The officials who bowed were not paying respect to the child, but breathing a silent prayer of relief. The iron hand that had gripped the court for half a century was finally gone, but their relief was the ultimate, terrible miscalculation. The iron hand had been all that held the world together. Now there was a vacuum. Puyi's father, the weak-willed Prince Chun, was named the Prince Regent. He was a man built for the measured cadence of poetry and the gentle solitude of gardens, not for the heavy, blood-soaked chains of imperial power. He inherited not a dynasty, but a sinking ship, navigated by men whose first loyalty was only to their own survival. The feuding began immediately, an endless, petty war for influence among the Manchu nobility. Cixi's final gift to the Qing was paralysis. Every faction, the royalists, the eunuchs, the minor princes, pushed for control, ensuring that every single decision was neutralized by competing interests. They spent their last, precious years arguing over titles and tea ceremonies, while the real world outside prepared to swallow them whole. Beyond the vermilion walls, the roar that Cixi had tried to suppress for so long now became articulate. It spoke in fiery political pamphlets printed illegally in Shanghai. It spoke in lectures delivered by students who had fled to Japan. It spoke of a new dawn, a republic, a structure of government that required no emperors at all. The central figurehead of this radical, impossible promise was Sun Yat-sen. He was an outsider, a quiet physician and an intellectual who understood that the true battlefield for China was not its border, but the mind of its people. His weapon was not the sword, but an ideology he called the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihood. These were concepts designed to dismantle the mandate of heaven, brick by brick, not with cannon fire but with logic. To the educated, this was salvation. To the commoner, this was the promise that the endless cycle of dynasty, corruption, and famine was finally, irrevocably broken. The court, sensing the ground shaking beneath its foundations, attempted to play the liberal. They issued frantic edicts promising an open national assembly, a full constitution, a glorious transition to modern governance. It was a grand, beautifully worded apology, penned in pure terror. But it arrived decades too late. The people saw it for what it was: a desperate, transparent trick to buy time and preserve the royal family's privileges. The only thing these reforms achieved was to reveal the true extent of the dynasty's fear. It showed the revolutionaries that the Qing was no longer powerful, but merely scared. The revolution was no longer a dream whispered in a Shanghai cellar. It was now a deadline. Every major city became a recruiting ground for the inevitable. Secret societies, radical intellectuals, and, crucially, the new army, modernized troops trained in Western tactics, began to consolidate their hidden power. They saw the bewildered boy on the throne. They saw the weakness of the regent. They saw the endless, fatal feuding. All they required was a sign, a spark, a moment of accidental chaos that would allow the dam to finally burst. In the city of Wucheng, far from the capital, a bomb factory was operating under the guise of a laundry. A poorly mixed batch of crude explosives detonated by accident, ripping the roof off the building. The local police arrived instantly, not knowing what they had stumbled upon. But in the resulting panic, the police found what every revolutionary government fears most: a list. A list of every single conspirator, every military officer, and every revolutionary cell planted inside the loyal new army regiments. The government now had the names of their enemies. The conspirators knew they were completely, fatally exposed. It was no longer a question of next month or next week. It was a question of tonight. The clock had stopped. The men in Wucheng had been given a death sentence by accident. There was no time left to negotiate, no time to flee, no time even to mourn the failure of their secrecy. The only choice left was to preempt the inevitable arrests. They had to fight tonight, or they would be dragged out and executed by dawn. The night was heavy and moonless, suffocating the city in a dense humidity. The first shot was not a battle cry. It was a desperate single crack that cut through the darkness. It came from the 8th Engineering Battalion. A young sergeant, his face hidden by the shadow of his cap, raised his pistol. He shot his own commanding officer, a man completely and unwaveringly loyal to the throne. Treason was no longer a whispered theory. It was now a sound. That solitary shot was the signal the entire revolutionary network had been waiting for. Within the hour, the city of Wucheng woke to a civil war exploding in its own barracks. The new army, the same modernized force intended to protect the dynasty, had turned its weapons on its masters. Men who had eaten together that morning were now hunting each other with fixed bayonets. Officers scramble. Ed for control, some loyal to the Qing, others secretly pledged to the Republic. The chaos was complete and terrifying. The revolutionaries moved with the speed of men who knew their own life depended on the next 5 minutes. They secured the city's main arsenal. They seized the treasury. They took the governor's office. By the first pale light of dawn, the revolution had claimed its first major city. The imperial governor himself was nowhere to be found, having fled in the darkness, scrambling frantically over the city wall like a common thief, stripped of all dignity and power. News traveled slow, filtered through fragmented, frantic telegrams. In the halls of the Forbidden City, the regent, Prince Chun, dismissed the initial reports as local unrest. A small, isolated mutiny, they assured him. Nothing the modern army could not swiftly crush. But the silence that followed the reports was deafening. It was not a mutiny. It was a vacuum. The throne had lost a city, and no one knew how to take it back. The dam had burst. Wucheng was the signal. The success of the uprising electrified every secret society and every radical intellectual in China. They saw that the invincible Qing was truly a phantom, that a few desperate men could bring down its local authority. Within days, the fire caught. The dominoes began to fall, one after another, down the length of the Yangtze River Valley. Hunan province declared its independence. Shanxi followed. Province after province, sensing the dynasty's fatal paralysis, broke away from Beijing. Within 4 weeks of that accidental bomb blast, 15 provinces had declared themselves free of the Qing Dynasty. 1,000 years of continuous imperial rule was unraveling in the space of a single lunar cycle. The regent's palace was now a theater of silent, high-stakes desperation. The boy Emperor Puyi's fate, and the very existence of the Qing, now hung on one despised name, a name the regent himself had banished. Yuan Shikai, the most powerful military leader in China, exiled after the death of the Empress Dowager Cixi, now living in quiet, strategic disgrace. They needed his Beijing army. They needed his ruthless efficiency. They had gambled their safety by exiling him, and now they were forced to bet their entire dynasty on his return. With a trembling hand, the regent signed the decree. The man he had banished as the single greatest threat to the Qing throne was now the only one who could possibly save it. Yuan Shikai knew the call would come. He did not return to the capital as a loyal servant, eager to restore his former masters. He arrived as a predator sensing blood in the water. His true goal was not to save the Qing dynasty. It was to claim its dying power for himself. He had been waiting for this moment in the enforced quiet of his estate, not just for weeks, but for years. Yuan Shikai rode the train back to Beijing not as a returning subject begging for forgiveness, but as a silent reckoning. The capital felt less like a seat of power and more like a tomb awaiting its caretaker. The moment he stepped onto the platform, the collective power of the collapsing Forbidden City did not rush out to greet him. It flowed inward, directly into him. He arrived at the palace like a creditor arriving at a debtor's door. The meeting with the regent, Zefeng, was a study in unequal desperation. The young prince saw not a savior, but the grim mirror of his own fatal failures. Yuan Shikai did not kneel. He presented a list of demands that was less a plan for counterinsurgency and more a ransom note for the dynasty's life. He would not just be reinstated. He would be the imperial prime minister, granted absolute, unquestioned control over all military spending, all major government appointments, and the entire budget of the state. The Manchu court was being asked to hand over the keys to its own kingdom. There was no negotiation left to be had. There was only the stunned, bitter acceptance that the price of their survival was the total loss of their authority. Within days, Yuan Shikai was dictator of the North. The first test was simple: show the world he was indispensable. His Beiyang army, the most modern fighting force in Asia, surged southward. They recaptured Hanyang. They pushed the revolutionary tide back from the Yellow River. The Qing court breathed a sigh of agonizing relief. But this was a staged war. Yuan was too shrewd to allow a complete victory. He knew that if the Manchu court was fully safe, they would immediately turn on him again, exactly as they had before. He needed the revolution to remain alive. He needed it to be a persistent, burning threat that justified his immense, unchecked power. He became the single pivot point in the conflict, the only man who could stop the bleeding, and crucially, the only man who could now speak to the patient. While his armies held the line in the north, Yuan Shikai opened a secret, parallel negotiation. The revolutionaries gathering in the south. The South had declared a provisional republic in Nanjing. The revolution now had a face and a voice in the person of Sun Yat-sen, the idealist, returned from his long exile abroad. Sun knew that without a functioning national army, his new republic could not hope to defeat Yuan Shikai's forces on the battlefield. The war was an unwinnable distraction. So the revolutionaries made a calculation born of cold, brutal necessity. They would give Yuan Shikai exactly what he truly wanted, the one prize he could not take without a bloody civil war. The South offered the presidency of the new Chinese Republic. The cost for Yuan was equally absolute. He must use his newfound authority to force the Qing emperor to abdicate. He was being asked to dismantle the throne from the inside, to execute a revolution by decree. Yuan Shikai sat at the center of history, holding the key to the forbidden city in one hand and the promise of a republic in the other. He had the power to end 2,000 years of the mandate of heaven. The boy emperor Puyi still played innocently in his sequestered gardens, unaware that the man who had been sworn to save his crown was already negotiating the price of its destruction. Yuan Shikai's treachery would not just save China from war, it would forever erase the imperial system that had ruled it since the age of Rome. All that was needed now was the final, irreversible signature, the one to end the dynasty, the one to begin the empire of himself. Yuan Shikai did not wait. The provisional presidency was his agreed price, and he now demanded the emperor's life in return. He did not march on the forbidden city with an army. He used the instruments of bureaucracy as a weapon, delivering a chilling ultimatum wrapped in a promise of peace. The stage was now the palace itself, silent and cold. The final decision fell to a single woman, the Empress Dowager Longyu, who ruled for the child Puyi. She had only ever known a life carved into the granite of tradition. She was the final living embodiment of the Dragon Throne's will, a tragic figure thrust into a national crisis she was not equipped to solve. Longyu was not a warrior or a politician. She was simply the keeper of the sacred line. Yuan Shikai laid out the two choices before her, each absolute. The alternative to abdication, he insisted, was a civil war that would not just depose the Qing, but utterly destroy them, drowning the northern provinces in peasant blood and foreign intervention. He offered an exit. The dynasty, he argued, could save its honor by voluntarily sacrificing its temporal power. A peaceful end, he promised, was a legacy infinitely more noble than a bloody, protracted death. He was asking her to sign the dynasty's own death warrant, but he softened the blow with an irresistible golden cage. The revolutionaries in the South had agreed to Yuan's terms. The imperial family would be allowed to keep their titles and their personal property. They would remain living within the forbidden city, respected, protected, and given a hefty annual stipend from the new republic. This secret agreement was the heart of Yuan's betrayal. He was not protecting the empire, only a small, gilded piece of it, enough to get the signature he needed. The ministers of the court wept as they gathered in the inner sanctum. They begged their empress to hold the line. They spoke of loyalty, of the duty owed to their ancestors, and of the divine right of the mandate of heaven. But loyalty could not feed the starving soldiers who were ready to mutiny, and divine right offered no protection against modern artillery. Long Yu was old, exhausted, and desperately afraid of becoming the woman who unleashed a slaughter. She saw her ancestors' spirits watching her. She saw the shadow of the armies massing outside. She made the decision alone, standing on the edge of 2 millennia of history. She took the brush, dipped it in the imperial ink, and signed the decree. A few elegant strokes across the yellow silk, and the Qing Dynasty vanished. It was February 12, 1912. The moment felt small, hidden, and utterly silent to the world outside the vermilion walls. A tiny, defeated woman had ended the world's longest continuous government. The 3-year-old Emperor Puyi was later taken to the Hall of Supreme Harmony. He was told he would never again have to learn Chinese characters because the empire was over. He was no longer the son of heaven, but merely a member of the new republic. The irony of the moment was absolute. The edict of abdication was delivered, and the world heard it. Yuan Shikai had won. The provisional government in Nanjing honored the deal, and Yuan Shikai was officially named the president of the Republic of China. He had betrayed his emperor for the highest office in the land. But for Yuan, this was not the end of a long journey toward democracy. It was merely the beginning of a larger, darker ambition. He had installed a republic as a means to an end, a short, necessary pause before the coronation of himself. The mandate of heaven had not been abolished. It had merely been stolen and placed in his keeping. He had brought down the throne of the Qing. Now, the ink was barely dry on the abdication edict, and President Yuan Shikai was already looking beyond the title of republic, toward the only title that truly held weight in his mind. He would not stop until he could force the dragon robe over his own shoulders. Yuan Shikai was a master of the double face. He had championed the republic only long enough to stand upon its highest platform. From that height, he could survey the landscape and see only one true path, the single, absolute authority of the throne. He had no faith in the messy, uncontrollable mechanics of democracy. He saw ballots as weakness and parliaments as nothing more than noise. His office remained rooted in Beijing, the cold, ancient seat of the emperors, not in the revolutionary fervor of Nanjing. He purposefully surrounded himself with the same generals and officials who had served the Qing, men who understood power not as consensus, but as command. The first great challenge came from the one man who had truly believed in the republic's promise, Sun Yat-sen. Sun's nationalist party, the Kuomintang, spoke of a true democracy, of a government answerable to the people, of a modern, forward-looking China. This was a direct, existential threat to Yuan Shikai's singular ambition. He reacted not with debate or negotiation, but with the cold, absolute finality of an emperor. The Kuomintang was ruthlessly suppressed. Their leaders were gunned down in the streets, or forced into desperate, lonely exile. This was not the work of a president building a nation. This was the dark work of a warlord clearing his path to a crown. The year 1914 saw the transformation complete. The republic was now merely a thin mask, a name printed on stationery. All pretense began to fall away. Yuan Shikai knew he could not simply proclaim himself emperor. The move must appear to be ordained by fate itself. A vast, intricate campaign was launched, orchestrated entirely from the hidden rooms of Yuan's own residence, yet presented to the public as the desperate, pleading cry of the nation. They called it the Society for the Planning of Peace. Their conclusion was simple, immutable, and preordained. China was fracturing, and the only salvation, the only source of stability, was the immediate return of the imperial throne. Petitions began to flood the capital, carefully forged demands for the restoration of the monarchy, with Yuan Shikai at its unquestionable head. The will of the people was manufactured with devastating comprehensive efficiency. A national vote was staged, a referendum in which every single hand-picked assembly, every easily bought province, every compliant military unit voted unanimously for Yuan to assume the imperial title. The numbers were astronomical. The fraud was absolute. Yuan played the part of the reluctant savior, agonizing publicly over the immense, heavy burden the people had supposedly forced upon him. He allowed the charade to drag out, ensuring maximum theatrical effect. The date was finally set. The mandate would be formally accepted. He would cast aside the thin, borrowed robes of the president and claim the ultimate armor. He would establish a new dynasty, known as the Hongxian. On December 12, 1915, the charade ended. The Great Deception had run its course. Yuan Shikai formally accepted the throne. He walked into the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the very stage where the 3-year-old Puyi had been paraded out of power, and accepted the title, the Great Emperor of the Chinese Empire. The Yellow Dragon had supposedly risen again from the ashes. But Yuan Shikai had fatally forgotten the one lesson that history always exacts upon its most ambitious students. Betrayal is a poison that returns to the source. The men and the provinces that he had betrayed for the presidency, the very soldiers who had fought the Qing in the name of a republic, had not forgotten the promises of freedom. The moment he crowned himself, the republic's promise struck back. Generals who had supported him under the guise of constitutional rule immediately declared their provinces independent. The south of China exploded in open, violent revolt. Yunnan, a province far from the quick reach of Beijing, fired the first definitive shot. The new dynasty, the Hongxian, was not greeted with loyalty and subservience, but with blood and defiance. The reign of Yuan Shikai, the great emperor, lasted exactly 83 days before he was plunged into a desperate, unwinnable civil war. The crown was impossibly heavy, and the mandate of heaven which he had stolen with such ruthless, precise planning now seemed to reject him utterly. He had sought ultimate peace, or he had achieved only the swift, catastrophic end of his own life. The final, dark chapter of Imperial China was about to be written, and it would be written in fire, shattering the dream of a new dynasty into 1,000 broken shards. The poison was not only political, it entered the blood. The physical toll of absolute, failed ambition broke the man known as Yuan Shikai. He had been a ruthless master of the game, a man who could outmaneuver the Empress Dowager and dissolve a republic, but he could not outmaneuver fate. The imperial seals he had cast for himself now sat upon a dying man's chest. The provinces declared independence with every fading breath he took. Finally, with the republic's armies closing in and his own generals advising retreat, the emperor bowed. He officially abolished the Hongxian dynasty. He was president once more, but the title was meaningless, a phantom limb on a dying body. 3 months later, on a humid June day in 1916, Yuan Shikai was dead. The man who had been the most powerful figure in Asia had vanished from history, leaving behind nothing but a fresh coat of blood on the palace stones. But the story did not end with the death of the betrayer. It only widened the disaster. Yuan Shikai was the heavy stone holding the arch of North China together. When he fell, the arch collapsed. The Beijing army, his loyal, professional engine of power, instantly fragmented. There was no longer one leader, no longer one voice of the central government, only a host of powerful generals who had spent decades learning from the master himself. They now simply inherited his ruthless methods and applied them to their own immediate personal kingdoms. The Republic of China, which had been fought for, dreamed of, and consecrated in the blood of revolutionaries, was now a name without a nation. It was merely a flag hanging over the empty halls of Beijing. The real power lay outside the capital, in the dusty, provincial garrisons and the personal armies of the local military governors. They were men of iron will and short tempers, equipped with modern weapons and an ancient lust for dominion. China entered its darkest period since the fall of the Han, the years of the warlords. They were not unified dynasties but armed fiefdoms, ruled not by law or mandate but by the gun. In the north, the fractured Beiyang generals, the Zhili clique, the Anhui clique, the Fengshan clique, fought vicious, sprawling wars over the control of the capital, treating the presidency itself like a prize to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. In the south, provinces nominally allied with the true republican ideals had become separate entities entirely, governed by their own military governors, equally unwilling to surrender their newfound authority. The lines on the map were invisible, drawn only by the reach of a general's cavalry and the thickness of his pocketbook. For the common man, the revolution had delivered a terrible, unforeseen exchange. They had expelled the benevolent but distant tax collector of the emperor, only to be besieged by the immediate, violent demands of dozens of local tyrants. Taxes were levied years in advance, conscription became simple kidnapping, and the constant movement of massive, armed forces meant fields lay fallow and famine became a chronic, annual visitor. China was a single nation that had become 100 different wars, all fought in the name of a republic no one truly honored. The final, formal collapse of the ancient imperial system had opened a historical wound so deep that it threatened to devour the entire body of the nation. It was a time when the dreams of the people were buried beneath the mud and the boots of the soldiers, a moment that demanded a new, ruthless kind of ambition, one that would seek not to reclaim the throne, but to smash the very idea of power. The stage was set for a new kind of terror, a terror that would emerge not from the palaces of Beijing, but from the grinding poverty and despair of the countryside. This was the moment a young man named Chiang Kai-shek began to watch the chaos and began to wait. This moment, this grim spectacle of generals devouring the nation, had a name: the warlord era. It was not a time of ambition, it was a time of avarice. The men who carved up China did not dream of a new dynasty. They dreamed only of the next shipment of foreign silver, the next regiment of conscripts. The shining promises of a republic, the ideals of freedom and unity, lay like shattered, worthless glass at the feet of the father of the nation himself, Sun Yat-sen. He was a man consumed by failure, yet still haunted by his own vision. He had expelled the emperor, but in doing so, he had lost the nation entirely. He tried to govern from the south, from his small base in Canton, surrounded by officers who spoke his language but obeyed only the laws of their own bank accounts. His party, the Kuomintang, the KMT, was a great rudderless SH. IP drifting toward historical irrelevance. He appealed to the West, to Britain and America, the great democracies he admired, begging for aid, for weapons, for the international recognition needed to build a central army capable of pushing back the warlords. The West offered only dismissal and cold silence. But one power watched from the Siberian cold, waiting for its moment to introduce a new, terrible fire into the dying embers of the old order. The Soviet Union answered the call. Moscow saw not a struggling democratic idealist, but a revolutionary opportunity. The price of their recognition, their crucial funding, and their stream of military advisors was steep and non-negotiable. The Kuomintang must accept a formal partnership with the fledgling, barely existing Chinese Communist Party. For Sun Yat-sen, this was a pact born of total desperation, a necessary poison to be swallowed for the greater good of unification. For the young communists, it was a sudden, miraculous key to the national stage, a guaranteed seat at the powerful political table they could never have earned alone. The KMT wanted national unity. The communists demanded immediate class war. They were oil and water, two irreconcilable ideologies forced into a single, agitated vessel by the sheer, overwhelming weight of historical necessity. The alliance was not a partnership. It was a fragile, ticking clock built only for mutual, eventual betrayal. Into this viper's nest of political compromise stepped the man who had been watching from the shadows, Chiang Kai-shek. He was not an intellectual or a revolutionary idealist. He was a pure soldier, a dark poet of necessary violence. He had seen the failure of politicians, and he saw the only remedy: a single, disciplined, ruthless army capable of marching over the bones of 100 petty tyrants. Sun Yat-sen sent him to Moscow, not for instruction in political theory, but for a deep apprenticeship in the hard machinery of war. Chiang Kai-shek spent months in the Soviet barracks, watching the efficiency of absolute command, the merciless purging of political dissent, and the flawless application of state power. He returned to China a transformed man, no longer a mere follower, but the architect of a new military machine. He was immediately given command of the Kuomintang's new kind of army school, the Whampoa Military Academy. It was here, on the Pearl River Delta, that the alliance of opposites was formalized under a unified banner. Kuomintang cadets marched alongside communist trainees, all united by a single, desperate, immediate cause: to reunite the nation by the force of arms. It was a shared dream built entirely on shared delusion. The man standing at the head of this new force was Chiang Kai-shek. He understood the lethal rules of this new game, where ideology was merely a tool and ruthlessness was the only true virtue. He was the only one in the room who truly knew that for the Chinese nation to survive, one of the two parties in that fragile, forced alliance would have to die. And he was meticulously preparing to be the one to wield the knife. The great military march north was coming, but it would be a march fueled not by Republican unity, but by the cold, calculated certainty of impending civil war. The great military march north was coming, but it would be a march fueled not by Republican unity, but by the cold, calculated certainty of impending civil war. The march began in the summer of 1926. A great, steel-tipped spear driving north from Canton, inland along the rivers and ancient pathways of the empire. Chiang Kai-shek named it the Northern Expedition, but it was less an expedition and more a reckoning. He had inherited the political fury of Sun Yat-sen, and now he was unleashing it upon the fractured shell of the nation. It was a holy war against the old system. The warlords, those last vestiges of the Qing's broken, corrupt administration, had carved the provinces into brutal little fiefdoms. They were weak. They were fat. The new Kuomintang army, hungry and fanatical, tore through them like fire through dry paper. The victories were swift, almost unbelievable. Hunan, Hubei provinces fell like dominoes made of dust. The peasants, sickened by decades of endless taxation and fear, welcomed the KMT soldiers as liberators, as agents of a terrifying but necessary future. The army moved faster than the propaganda, faster than the news of their coming. But with every mile gained, the illusion of unity cracked further. The alliance was a single body with two opposing hearts. The political commissars of the Kuomintang, many of them communists, moved into the newly captured cities. They did not settle for mere military rule. They organized the workers, rallied the unions, and turned the chaos of conquest into a feverish social revolution. They demanded land reform and the immediate overthrow of the traditional order. For Chiang Kai-shek, the military campaign was strictly about power, about centralizing the state under his singular martial command. For his communist allies, it was about seizing the means of production, about the fundamental, brutal overthrow of the entire social order. They had marched together, but they were not fighting for the same China. Chiang watched this revolutionary fervor with a deep, silent suspicion. He saw the communists were building a power base not within his army, but beneath his feet, in the streets, in the factories, in the minds of the desperate poor. The time for shared delusion was running out. The ultimate prize lay just ahead, shimmering on the coast like a dark, perfect jewel: Shanghai. The city of endless money, the true heart of China's financial power, where Western greed and Chinese corruption mixed into a toxic, glittering brew. To control, Shanghai was not just to control a city. It was to control the economic destiny of the entire country. The Northern Expeditionary Army advanced, but the Communists went ahead of the vanguard. The man organizing the underground resistance was Zhou Enlai. He was intellectual, ruthless, and utterly patient. While Chiang's cannons were still miles away, Zhou Enlai had already led a successful, massive uprising within the city walls. They had tried and failed twice, but the third time, the workers took the city for themselves. They drove out the warlord garrison, seizing police stations and armories. They waited only for the arrival of the Northern Expeditionary Army to legalize their triumph. They waited for Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang paused his command outside the city limits. He looked down the river at the lights of the vast, conquered metropolis. His allies, the Communists, had delivered the greatest, most valuable city in Asia directly into his hands. They had bled for it. They had organized the masses. They had made the impossible possible. But if he marched in now, he would be forced to share the prize. He would be indebted to the very forces he intended to destroy. The question was no longer if the knife would be drawn. It was who would be holding it when the two movements finally met in the teeming, shadow-choked streets of Shanghai. He would not share the financial heart of the new China. He could not. The order to enter the city was delayed. Instead, silent, cryptic messages began to move, not north toward his allies but back, deep into the dark, hidden channels of Shanghai's criminal underworld. The reckoning, cold and absolute, had arrived at the gates. They waited. The Communists waited for their great ally to deliver the final stamp of legality to their triumph. The red banners flew over the central police headquarters, a defiant, temporary symbol of worker power. For 3 days, Shanghai held its breath, a brief, fragile moment of hope and exhaustion. Zhou Enlai and his men stood proud, believing they had bled for and delivered the future. But the future, like any valuable prize, was already being stolen. To take a city from an army is one kind of war. To take it from its own people requires another kind of general. Chiang Kai-shek's silent, cryptic messengers did not ride out to the Communists waiting in the streets. They descended instead into the opulent, velvet-lined smoke dens of the French concession, to the man who truly owned the city, Du Yuesheng, known to all as pockmarked Du. Du Yuesheng was not a mere criminal. He was the dark engine of Shanghai's life. He was the Green Gang, controlling the docks, the banks, the labor unions, and the vast, invisible supply chain of opium and commerce that kept the city breathing. Chiang Kai-shek was a rising star of nationalism. Du Yuesheng was the darkness beneath the pavement. The arrangement was quick, brutal, and entirely transactional. Chiang offered the full, unchallengeable protection of the state. Du Yuesheng offered the ruthless efficiency of the knife. Du saw the Communists not as a political ally, but as an existential threat to his supply lines, his workers, and his absolute control of the streets and the profits. A deal was struck in the deep night, a handshake that cemented the new government in a foundation of blood and opium. Du needed 3,000 men, not soldiers but executioners, dock workers, enforcers, and killers dressed in civilian clothes. The trap was elegantly simple. The Communists, weary from their uprising, had centralized their key leaders and weapons in the Shanghai General Labor Union headquarters. They had put all their faith, all their triumph, into one easily encircled building. April 12, 1927. The city slept on its hope. The clock hit 4 a.m. It was not a battle that began, but an extermination. The first shots were not cannons or coordinated rifle fire, but small-caliber pistols fired in the dark. The Green Gang men, wearing white armbands to identify themselves to Chiang's advancing command, surged from the alleys and back streets. They struck the organ. Ized workers where they were most vulnerable, their homes, their temporary garrisons, their meeting halls. They were armed with axes, cleavers, and hidden pistols, moving with the terrifying intimacy of men who knew every shadow of their hunting ground. This was a purge executed from the inside out. Inside the headquarters of the labor union, the leaders woke to the sound of screaming, not celebration. Zhou Enlai, calm even in the face of absolute disaster, knew instantly what it was. This was not a clash. This was betrayal. This was the reckoning. The revolution they had built on trust and idealism was now being drowned in the blood of their comrades. Outside, the Green Gang smashed the doors, led by Chiang's own officers, who arrived, not as liberators but as silent, uniformed witnesses to the slaughter. They blocked the exits and cordoned off the streets. The workers scrambled for the weapons they had seized days before, but the trap was sprung. The lights went dark across the city as the knives descended, and the alliance, born in war, died in a sudden, sickening, and irreversible act of mass murder. The screaming stopped before the sun fully rose. The sound that replaced it was the terrible silence of a city that knows it has witnessed a tragedy too vast to speak of. The humid Shanghai streets, only hours before alight with revolutionary fervor, were now slick and silent. They were stained, not just with blood, but with the irreversible knowledge of what men will do to secure power. Chiang Kai-shek emerged from the operation not as a man who had won a battle, but as a man who had completed a necessary extermination. He did not waver. He stood, immaculate in his uniform, and declared that the revolution was now purified. The cleansing had rid the Nationalist Party of the Soviet disease, of the communist cancer that threatened to corrupt the Chinese soul. He announced a new nationalist government, now officially seated in Nanjing. This was more than a military victory. It was the formal end of the fragile alliance, the final tearing of the United Front's banner. All communist sympathizers were to be arrested, their papers seized, their names added to immediate execution lists. The men who had fought alongside the nationalists to free the South were now declared enemies of the state. The Green Gang men, their work done, melted back into the anonymity of the slums, their terrible intimacy with the city now a terrifying ghost in the alleyways. Chiang had secured the loyalty of the cities, the wealth of the banks, and the recognition of the Western powers. He controlled the ports and the commerce. He had won the future. Or so he thought. The massacre had succeeded only in driving the communist movement deeper underground. It did not destroy the idealism. It forged it into a hard, desperate core of survival. For Zhou Enlai, the escape from the headquarters was a matter of sheer luck and ruthless calculation. Moving through the gray lanes, seeing the bodies of his comrades lined up for disposal, he understood the new reality. There was no negotiated peace. The game was over. They were no longer partners, they were ghosts. The order went out to all surviving leaders: abandon the cities. The revolution that had been born in the modern factories and lecture halls of the coast was now forced to retreat to the most ancient, forgotten parts of China. They fled the Shanghai concrete for the dirt roads and the vast, unreachable mountains of the interior provinces. The new enemies were not warlords, but the very men they had called brother. This flight was the great historical pivot. Chiang Kai-shek had pushed the Communist Party out of the light of the cities and into the shadow of the Chinese peasantry. He had cut the head off the snake, but he had left the body to wriggle away and grow a new one. In this sudden, violent exodus, the leaders who survived were fundamentally changed. They were hardened by betrayal and fueled by a burning, absolute conviction that only a total, ruthless war would now win the soul of China. The liberal, idealistic hope of the early revolution was dead, drowned in the dark waters of the Wangpu River. A civil war had not merely started, it had been guaranteed. While Chiang stood victorious in Nanjing, solidifying his control over the modern apparatus of state, a small, desperate band of survivors began to rally in the forgotten, mountainous region of Jiangxi. They were wounded, broken, and hunted by the most powerful army China had seen in decades. They sought refuge in the remote hamlets, far from the railways and telegraphs. It was here, in the cold, brutal isolation of the interior, that a new kind of leader would rise from the shadows. A man who understood the peasant, who did not trust the cities, and whose singular, terrifying ruthlessness would finally meet Chiang's own. Mao Zedong had been driven to the edge of the map, and from that edge he began to prep a vengeance that would redefine the course of Chinese history. For thousands of years, the Dragon Throne had held China captive in its own past. The Qing, in their final decades, only tightened that knot. We have walked the polished floors, heard the whispers in the Forbidden City, and witnessed the crushing weight of the Son of Heaven's title. It was an epic built on ceremony, on the absolute belief that the Emperor was the only bridge between the human world and the celestial sphere. Yet, the palace itself was a gilded cage, a universe unto itself where power became a paralyzing isolation. The sheer scale of the dynasty could not protect it from the small, intimate betrayals inside the walls. The Emperor, the mandate of heaven personified, was perhaps the loneliest figure in the empire. He governed a world but could not control his own courtyard. He was a deity trapped by tradition. History does not stop for reverence. It simply waits for the walls to crack. And so, the mandate was ultimately revoked, not with a sudden, violent eruption, but with a slow, agonizing sigh. The golden roofs and jade carvings, once monuments to eternal power, became ghosts of memory. The last roar of the dragon was swallowed by the silence of the new republic. Today, the Forbidden City stands quiet. The scent of ancient incense is long gone, replaced by the rush of millions of tourists and the hum of a different age. Yet beneath the pavement of modern Beijing, the shadows of the last empire still stretch long. They remind us that even the most magnificent, unshakable power is ultimately built on fragile human secrets. The throne is empty, but the echoes of the Qing still resonate across the land they once ruled. The past in China is never truly past.